Number 10. Camp Hero. At the eastern tip of Long Island, there's a place called Camp Hero State Park. It's within this seemingly normal park that something ominous is hiding. It's an abandoned military base, one that was supposedly the inspiration behind the wildly popular Netflix show Stranger Things. According to Joe Lafreno, who's been working at the park for 18 years, the abandoned facility has dominated his life and his nightmares. The thing about the abandoned Camp Hero is that for decades, locals in Montauk have told tales of secret government experiments happening inside the facility. There are rumors of government-funded mind control experiments and so much worse. Everything from time travel to teleportation, and even cloned children connected with wires and hidden in underground labs. The rumors started around 1992, 11 years after the military base had already been shut down and gone to neglect. People believed the US government was involved in Nazi-like experiments, almost certainly genetic and psychological experiments involving local children that they kidnapped. Park worker Joe Lafreno even believes he was one of the kidnapped children, and that the government performed horrible experiments on him and then erased his memory. None of these rumors or accusations have ever been confirmed. The truth is that Camp Hero has a military history going back to the Revolutionary War. It was used as an army base during World War II, designed to look like a fishing village to trick the Nazis. The Air Force took over the site shortly after the war, but it was finally shut down and abandoned in 1981. In the years since, the camp has slowly been falling apart. Its 90-foot tower is horribly rusted, with its dish looking like it's about to crash to the ground. Number 9. The Forgotten Cannon in Helsinki. Construction on the Viapori fortress in Finland began in 1748. Over the next 60 years, the fortress was built into a massive and formidable defense layer like something out of a James Bond movie. The stronghold was spread across 8 islands, 6 of them heavily fortified, and only about a mile from the city center of Helsinki. And although these days the fortress island chain is mostly used for family picnics, it was once a place of blood and sacrifice. It was the Swedish who commenced the construction of the fortress as a way to protect themselves against Russian expansion. Then, during the Finnish War, Sweden gave the fortress to Russia. This happened in May of 1808. The fortress then remained in the control of Russian forces until Finnish independence in 1917. They held on to the thing for over a century, using it as their own defensive fort. But when the Finnish took their country back, the fort was theirs and they renamed it Suomenlinna, meaning Castle of Finland. The fortress was used in 1939 when the Winter War broke out. It was a base for a small Finnish submarine fleet and allegedly spent some time as a prison camp for Russian soldiers. Many men were executed and slaughtered here, but all of that changed when the war was over and the fort was no longer useful. Although never fully abandoned, the fortress was left to decay on its own. Grass grew onto the tall fortress walls, the cannons were disarmed and left to rust, and these days the fort is little more than a tourist attraction. Its long since dormant guns are still aimed at the sea. Number 8. The Cold War Submarine Graveyard. Located near Russia's Kola Peninsula in Olenja Bay, there's a graveyard of submarines from the Cold War. It's a fascinating place because it's at the edge of an otherwise beautiful tundra, a natural wilderness with animals like reindeer, polar bears, and even wolverines. Right at the border of this backcountry, half hidden by the water of the bay, there are abandoned submarines that once prowled the waters. Most of the submarines here were functional in the 1950s and 60s, but submarines don't exactly have the longest lifespans. Typically, submarine parts start to malfunction after 20 to 30 years of operation. Joints stop working properly, bits and pieces of gear become unreliable, and the underwater vessel needs to be retired. When that happened in the 1970s, the submarines were brought to Olenja Bay and left to rot. Some of the submarines were used as target practice over the years, shot at until they sank beneath the waves and out of sight. Others were just left on the shores of the bay to slowly leak oil and pollute the natural environment. It wasn't until the 1990s that a private company did what the government should have done and began disassembling the ships and recycling their materials. But even with that little bit of help, plenty of abandoned vessels are still there today. There are at least 7 or 8 gigantic submarines abandoned in the remote Russian wilderness. Number 7. Radioactive helicopters. The Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine is the area surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. You know, the one that had a meltdown in 1986 and caused one of the biggest radioactive disasters in history. And while most of what people see in the media from Chernobyl is the famous Ferris wheel, the abandoned buildings, and the creepy village, there is so much more. One of the most interesting places in Chernobyl is Rasokha. This was the burial ground for the military vehicles and other pieces of equipment used during the containment emergency to get the reactor under control. This place is a vehicle graveyard, but the vehicles are all extremely radioactive. There are buses, trucks, emergency vehicles, and even helicopters. The graveyard is home to multiple Mi-8 and Mi-6 helicopters, and even some wheeled armor carriers and chemical reconnaissance vehicles. The problem was that these vehicles were used to secure Chernobyl, to save everyone who could be saved, and to escort civilians away from the danger. But when all the work was done, the vehicles had absorbed too much of the dangerous radiation and had to be abandoned somewhere. Just like the entire Pripyat town that was completely deserted within hours, these vehicles were left to die. Number 6. The Vist Tunnels. Vis Island in the Adriatic Sea, officially part of Croatia, has played many roles throughout history. The island was occupied by the Greek thousands of years before modern times. The ruins of their lost towns can be found all across the island, and even the remains of an ancient fortress hidden within a hillside. But there are also a lot of relics from World War II scattered throughout the island. There are abandoned ships, forgotten planes, and all kinds of lost pieces of war equipment that are slowly being reclaimed by nature. In 1945, Vis Island was a major military base occupied by the Yugoslav army. The whole island was crawling with military personnel. It looked very different than it does today. There are at least 30 main military objects abandoned on the island: a command center, an army barracks, an underground hospital, and a secret missile base. There was a tunnel and bunker complex hiding underneath the surface, capable of blasting missiles from deep within the island. The control center was underground, with all eyes on Italy in case the Italians sent their troops over the border. Although these tunnels are now deserted, they haven't been destroyed. Visitors to Vis Island can still find the entrances to the dark and claustrophobic tunnels, and amazingly, they're mostly open. You can walk straight into the old World War II tunnels and start exploring the inside of the abandoned base. You can even poke your head into the old bunkers to inspect the rusted cannons still pointed at the sea. Would you like to check out the Vis tunnels? Tell us why or why not in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. The Ghost Fleet of Truk Lagoon. On the bottom of the ocean floor in a Micronesian tropical paradise, there are hundreds of abandoned wrecks from World War II. This is the Ghost Fleet of Truk Lagoon, considered one of the largest underwater graveyards of military vehicles in the world. That's because here, for 2 days in 1944, Allied soldiers bombed the beaches relentlessly. The Caroline Islands in Micronesia were utterly obliterated, and it was all to put an end to Japan's imperial fleet once and for all. The lagoon was home to the most destructive fleet in the Japanese arsenal. It was basically the Japanese version of Pearl Harbor, a huge military base with all their best ships waiting to strike. But on February 17, 1944, 5 American fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with support of over 500 aircraft, attacked the Japanese fleet at their own base. It was a surprise attack and a big gamble, but it paid off immensely. The Japanese had recently moved additional support ships into the area, making the target even juicier. The Americans managed to blow apart an estimated 250 Japanese aircraft and over 50 ships. Following the intense battle, the ships and aircraft that were destroyed were abandoned. Anything that couldn't be driven away was left to sink to the bottom of the lagoon. Almost all the remains down there are in the exact same spot they were nearly a century ago. Truk Lagoon is now one of the most popular diving sites in the world. It's the only place you can physically immerse yourself in the destruction of World War II, floating amongst the twisted metal and ripped wires of hundreds of Japanese vehicles. Number 4. Communist Airport. In Croatia, the Zeljava Air Base is an abandoned ruin located underneath a mountain. It's been empty and unused for over 2 decades, sitting right on the border of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The base is currently home to a small graveyard of fighter jets, reconnaissance aircraft, and various other airplanes slowly being reclaimed by nature. Most of the planes have already had all their major components ripped out or scavenged, and so they're really just empty husks. If anything, that's made it easier for nature to grow up and into them, while slowly dragging the aircraft down into the dirt. Most of these planes were abandoned at the former airbase when it was destroyed during the Bosnian War of 1992. Back when Yugoslavia existed, Zeljava Air Base was its largest underground airport. It was also one of the largest subterranean airports in Europe. The bunkers for the aircraft were carved into the side of a mountain, with the entirety of the base being sheltered under countless tons of rock and concrete. The base supposedly cost billions of dollars, but it was only used for a handful of years before conflict broke out and the whole place was destroyed. Number 3. The Reserve Fleet. The Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet is technically, according to the U.S. Maritime Administration, a fleet of vessels waiting to be put into service for matters of national defense or in the event of a national emergency. The Reserve Fleet isn't currently being used for anything, but it could be brought into service should some kind of large conflict break out. The idea behind the program started in 1946 when World War II ended. America thought it would be a good idea to have a reserve fleet in case something similar happened. Then, with the slow encroachment of the Cold War, a reserve fleet seemed even more necessary. The program had over 2,000 ships ready to go with a moment's notice by 1950. But as the years went by, the reserve fleet became less and less relevant, and many of the vehicles were abandoned. These days, only a small portion of the original vessels are still in the Suisun Bay, which is located off the coast of California. And as of February 2017, the government has decided to scrap every last remaining reserve ship. And so, even though some boats are still sitting in the water, they're effectively abandoned. The reserve fleet has been disbanded, and the boats are all being sent to their death. Number 2. Abandoned Battery. The J-4 abandoned naval battery was ready for action as recently as the 1980s. It's currently a decommissioned and abandoned piece of military history, but was once part of a larger defense system across the Spanish coastline. Originally built in 1936, the J4 battery was connected by a series of underground tunnels to other batteries all overlooking the coastline. The job of this wall of defense was to keep invaders out of Spain. When it was originally built, the battery was equipped with 2 British naval guns that were salvaged from a sunken battleship in 1923. But for all the effort, the battery never saw that much action, and by the time the 1980s rolled around, the whole place was deemed redundant and decommissioned. It's now an abandoned ruin. Number 1. Remote Alaskan bombs. In the middle of nowhere, Alaska, Army engineers were recently called in to solve a problem. A crew with the Army Corps of Engineers traveled to Fort Glenn to safely clear and detonate bombs left over from World War II. But before we get to the bombs, let's look at the history of Fort Glenn. It was a military installation built in secret on the Aleutian Islands about 850 miles from Anchorage in Alaska. It became a functional military outpost in late 1941. One of the main purposes of the remote base was to dispose of munitions and explosives. There was a small chunk of land set aside to throw bombs, bullets, and all other things that go boom into the trash. The issue today is that not all of the ordnance was detonated, and live bombs and explosives were thrown into these garbage pits. Then, when the war was over, Fort Glenn was abandoned, and nobody ever went back to occupy the island. The workers with the Army Corps were prepared to extract a massive number of abandoned explosives, projectiles, landmines, rockets, and even grenades. They were expecting over 2,000 individual items to be dug out of the soil on the island. What they hadn't expected was to come across multiple 500-pound bombs and about 2 dozen medium bombs of 20 pounds each. It took 2 summers between 2020 and 2021 just to rid the abandoned fort of its lingering explosives. Which of these abandoned pieces of military history did you find the most interesting? Let us know in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe before you go, and come back soon for more amazing videos right here on American Eye.